Stop everything and stay with this until the very end, because what you are about to witness is not just a story about fame or heartbreak. It is the exact moment a life changed direction in a way no one expected, and when Sukai quietly stepped away from everything he had built after the emotional reveal involving Tan Songyun, it did not feel like a decision. It felt like the end of one world and the uncertain beginning of another. At first, no one believed it. Rumors appear all the time. Stories exaggerate. Moments are taken out of context. But this felt different, not because it was louder, but because it was quieter. There were no dramatic announcements, no emotional speeches, just absence. A slow and noticeable shift in presence. Sukai stopped appearing where people expected him to be. Projects paused. Schedules adjusted. Conversations changed. And those who were paying attention began to notice something that could not be ignored. He was pulling away, not suddenly, but deliberately, as if he had reached a point where continuing forward in the same direction no longer made sense. The turning point did not come from the public. It came from something deeper, something that had been building beneath the surface long before anyone saw the signs. The emotional reveal tied to Tan Songyun did not create the change. It exposed it, because what people saw as a moment was actually the result of something that had been growing quietly for a long time. The connection between them had never been simple, not in the way people imagined, not in the way stories often present. It was real, layered, filled with moments that carried meaning beyond what was visible. And when something like that shifts, it does not just affect one part of your life. It affects everything. Sukai had always been composed, focused, able to move through the demands of his career with precision. But there are moments when even the most controlled paths begin to feel uncertain, when success no longer feels like fulfillment, when the noise of everything around you becomes too loud to ignore. And in those moments, people are faced with a choice: continue or step away. He chose to step away, not completely at first. Not in a way that made headlines, but enough. Enough to create distance. Enough to allow himself space to think, to feel, to understand what he actually wanted beyond everything that had been expected of him. The idea of an ordinary life began to take shape, not as an escape, but as a possibility. Something quieter, something simpler, something that did not require constant performance, constant attention, constant pressure. And that idea grew stronger, not because he rejected everything he had built, but because he began to realize that what he was searching for could not be found within it. The people around him noticed, not through what he said, but through what he stopped doing, the way he spoke differently, the way he seemed more present in moments that had nothing to do with work, the way he no longer rushed toward the next opportunity, as if he had finally allowed himself to slow down. Tan Songyun remained part of that realization, not as a cause, but as a reflection, because sometimes it is through another person that we begin to understand ourselves more clearly. Her emotional reveal did not push him away. It revealed what he was already feeling: the uncertainty, the vulnerability, the awareness that some things cannot be controlled no matter how much effort is put into them. And that awareness changed everything. The final decision did not come in a single moment. It came gradually, through small realizations, through quiet thoughts that became clearer over time, until one day, the path he had been following no longer felt like the one he wanted to continue on. And that is when he chose, not fame, not expectation, but something unknown, something ordinary, something real. The reaction from the outside world was immediate: confusion, speculation, questions that demanded answers. But answers were not what he was offering, because this was not a decision made for others to understand. It was a decision made for himself. And that is what made it powerful, because walking away from something that defines you is never easy. It requires clarity. It requires courage. It requires accepting that not everyone will understand. But understanding is not always the goal. Sometimes the goal is simply to live in a way that feels true. So this story does not end with him leaving. It does not end with heartbreak. It does not end with a clear resolution. It ends with something far more meaningful. A person choosing a different path, not because it is easier, but because it is real. And now the only question that remains is this. When everything you have built no longer feels like where you belong, do you continue because it is expected? Or do you walk away and discover what your life could be without it? If this story made you feel something real and made you question what truly matters, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear that sometimes the bravest decision is not moving forward. It is choosing a completely different path. The moment the world began to realize he was not coming back the way they expected, everything shifted into something deeper, something quieter, something far more real than anyone had imagined. And if you stay with this until the very end, you're going to understand why what Soo Kai chose was not an escape from fame. It was a movement towards something he had been searching for long before Tan Songyun ever revealed the emotions that brought everything into the open. At first, people waited, not patiently, but hopefully. They assumed it was temporary, a pause, a moment to breathe before returning stronger, because that is what usually happens. People step back, and then they come back. Bigger, louder, more determined. But this was different. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into something that no longer felt like a break. There were no hints of a comeback. No subtle signs. No quiet confirmations. Just distance. Consistent. Unwavering. And that consistency began to speak louder than any announcement ever could. Soo Kai was no longer just stepping away. He was letting go. Not dramatically. Not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that made it clear that he was choosing something else. Something outside of what everyone had always known him for. The world he had been part of continued without him. Projects moved forward. New faces appeared. Conversations shifted. But there was a space where he used to be, a presence that could not simply be replaced. And people felt it, not because they were told to, but because absence has a way of making impact more visible than presence ever could. Meanwhile, his life began to change in ways that no one could fully see. Not through headlines, not through public appearances, but through small moments, quiet ones, the kind that do not attract attention, but define everything. He woke up without urgency, without schedules dictating every second, without the constant awareness of being watched. And at first, that silence felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, because when you have lived in noise for so long, quiet can feel like something is missing. But slowly, that quiet began to transform. It became space. Space to think. Space to breathe. Space to exist without expectation. And in that space, he began to understand something he had not allowed himself to fully feel before. He had been moving forward for so long that he had never stopped to ask where he actually wanted to go. Success had always been the direction. But direction is not the same as purpose. And purpose was what he was finally beginning to explore. The memory of Tan Songyun did not disappear. It remained. Not as something painful, but as something meaningful, because her honesty had forced him to confront his own. Her fear had mirrored his own uncertainty. Her words had created a moment that could not be ignored. And that moment became the turning point, not because it ended something, but because it revealed everything. He did not resent it. He did not try to move away from it. Instead, he accepted it as part of the journey that led him here, to this new version of his life. The final realization came quietly, not in a dramatic moment, not through a sudden decision, but through a simple understanding. He did not need to return to what he had left behind to prove anything. He did not need to explain his choices for them to be valid. He did not need to follow the path that others expected for his life to have meaning. And that understanding brought something unexpected. Peace. Not perfect, not constant, but real. The kind of peace that comes from alignment, from knowing that where you are is where you chose to be. The outside world continued to ask questions, to speculate, to wonder if this was truly the end. But the answer was not something that could be given in a statement, because this was not about ending a career. It was about beginning a life that had been waiting beneath everything else. And that life did not need validation. It did not need approval. It only needed to be lived. So this story does not end with him walking away. It does not end with heartbreak. It does not end with uncertainty. It ends with something far more powerful.
A choice.
A quiet, deliberate choice to live differently. To step away from what defined him in the eyes of others. And step into something that defined him for himself. And now the only question that remains is this. When you finally reach a point where everything you have built no longer feels like where you belong, do you stay because it is safe? Or do you walk away and discover who you are without it? If this story made you feel something real and made you question what truly matters, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to understand that sometimes the most powerful move is not chasing more. It is choosing less, because the next chapter of this story may not be louder, but it will be more real than anything that came before.